Let me invite Professor Irfan Habib to chair the session. Professor Irfan Habib.
Friends, it's usual in the sessions of the Indian History Congress to have the Professor S.C. Memorial Lecture on the first evening and a symposium on the second. The Executive Committee decided at the last session that in the 79th session, the symposium will be devoted to the issue of myths and history. Myths also have a history of their own, of course, and history of myths is, of course, history. But there are different kind of myth when history is converted into myth. Both the kinds of myths, I hope, would be covered in the discussion today. There would be three speakers. I invite Professor Sri Prakash to speak on the myths in ancient India.
Thank you, Professor Habib. You were saying that there's also a history of myths. I'm not a historian, but I'm a historian of sorts of myths because I deal with literature and I'm a playwright and poet. I'm dealing with myths and mythology all the time. I don't normally present papers, but I was compelled to do it this time by my friend Mahalakshmi, who's not here. So anyway, let me read this. It's called Transformations of Hero Myths in South Indian Literary Culture. I would like to trace the history of myths of the hero in South Indian literary cultures during the ancient period. Though the focus will be on myths shaped in the ancient period, I'll also be talking briefly about the afterlife and transformations of myths, the transformation of the later period. The transformation of myths are no doubt affected by historical changes, but I do not see a cause and effect relationship between myth and history. There seems to be an endless dialectics between the two modes of narrating the self, community, and the cosmos. One more preliminary point is in order. Experts have emphasized the cyclical nature of myths, which philosophers like Cassirer considered as belonging to the non-rational and mythopoeic mode of perception as opposed to logical, mathematical mode. Max Miller considered mythology to be the disease of language. Such positions relegate myths to the status of an epiphenomenon. History thus becomes real and myth imaginary. There's also the opposite view that puts history on par with myth, considering both to be just narratives. And this is the trick that Balagangadhara, who's now emerged as a very important historian of religions, playing in his recent publications. My own position in these matters is close to Wole Soyinka's in his book Myth, Reality in African Literature. He argues that though myth and history are two culture-specific ways of telling stories, there's no need to consider them opposites just because they have different temporalities. Also, a valid mode of remembering, myth too contains history, though it presents it in more figurative ways. The reason why, according to Soyinka, Judo-Christian and Eurocentric approaches accorded greater truth value to history, according to him, is the lack of emphasis on volition, which is fully in European worldview, which is fully at work in myth building. What is common to both history, myth, is a storehouse of community-specific images, characters, situations, which Nagugi calls orature, it's not orality, orature, that informs all cultural expressions of the community. For instance, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are such oratures that inform all narratives, descriptive, performative expressions in India. One thing common to all myth-making processes is the myth of the hero, no matter whether it centers around the cosmos, community, individual, or objects. Man hero, first section, man hero as winner and warrior. In ancient Sangam poetry, Tamil Sangam poetry, the male hero dominates. This in spite of the fact that Agam, the domain of love, and Puram, the domain of war, are female and male-centric respectively. This can be traced not only to the patriarchy of those times, but also the all-pervading myth of ancient Tamil religion, which accorded the status of the sacred to two objects, the king's throne and the woman's virginity. Consider these poems. These are a couple of Aham poems where the woman is speaking of her absent lover. My heart aches, my heart aches. My eyelids burn from holding back these hot tears. My love, who alone comforts me, is called unworthy by even the moon. My heart aches, my heart aches. Another. Flowers from morning glory, beach vines and water lilies, plaited into long garlands, drenched our tresses there, as slick crabs fled from me and my friends and into the sea. Just one day's raucous games with that god of the show has bitten off our entwining friendship. Strange what a dearth desire makes. Characters in this world full of women, but is still ruled by men. However intense their love, they are nameless. But in Puram, riveted around man and his war exploits, people and places are specifically named. He is devoted to the celebration of male heroes. Here is a poem by Avaya. The young bull is about a specific king called Pottelini. The young bull does not feel the yoke, though the cart is loaded with salt and things, but who can foresee the damages when it dips into creeks and climbs the hills? So the salt merchants keep a second safety axle under the axle tree. You are such lofty one with bright umbrellas of fame. Whoever lives in your shade, living under the fullest moon, has any fear of night. A similar one. Like the clouds who form part of an endless family, raining down on the dry reservoirs, on the wide fields, even on arid salt flats rather than where they might be useful, with his elephants in rut, wore anklets on his feet. This is Penkan, that's the name of the king, ignorant though he is of how to grant gifts, marching against an enemy. Army, no ignorance, marches with him. When man goes winning and warring, the woman waits in patience. This mytheme, some mythologists use the word mytheme as a unit of myth. This mytheme of man, the hero, lives on in later period in regions of Karnataka where Sangam conventions of literary culture were completely unknown. For instance, the famous Kannada inscriptional poem of 7th century, this is called Badami Shasana, Badami inscription, says of an unnamed king hero. It says, Sadhu ge sadhu, madhuryenge madhuryan, badippa kaliye kaliga paritan, madhava nitan piranalla. Kind to the kind, sweet to the sweet. He is cruel like Kali Yuga to a challenging warrior. He is literally Madhava. The poet not only lauds his patron king's valor, but also his sweetness. This is further reinforced by comparing him to Madhava, none other than Lord Krishna. Next section. Jina, transformation of the hero as the conqueror of the conqueror. The court of Amogavarsha, Nripatunga, was, uh, was adorned by a great poet and saint, Acharya Jinasena, who composed a great Sanskrit poem, Purva Purana, the story of Adinath Tirthankara. This was retold by the first Kannada poet Pampa in Adi Purana a century later. In these works, the mythical paradigm of the hero as the winner and warrior gets a new twist in the key episode of the war between Bharata and his younger brother Bahubali, both sons of Puru Chakravarti, now Adinatha Tirthankara. After inheriting the empire from his father, Bharata sets out conquering all the three worlds. When he returns triumphant to his capital Ayodhya, he is reminded that he has not yet conquered his younger brother Bahubali. Bahubali refuses to yield, and a fight between them ensues. Bahubali defeats his world-conquering brother Bharata in all stages of the duel. But at that dramatic moment, he has a change of heart. He realizes at that moment of conquering the conqueror, like his father Puru did while watching the evanescent dance of a heavenly dancer Nilanjana, the baseness of Rajya Lakshmi. It's a very important word. Puru's experience the heavenly woman's dance, Puru's experience of the heavenly woman's dance, no matter how beautiful, was also unreal, the poet says, like a bolt of lightning. Rajya Lakshmi, the woman earth. At this stage, ancient kavyas never speak about the mother earth, only woman earth. The earth is a marriageable woman. Dharavanite, they say. Rajya Lakshmi. Woman earth also appears to Bahubali as inconstant. Let her dwell in your heart, that stealer of hearts, Rajya Lakshmi, who, like a lost bee, flits and flirts about in the blood-red lotus ponds of warriors' swords. What use? If I fall for the land of love that you desire, will not my greatness be sullied? In Kannada, it's beautiful. ನೆಲಸೊಗಲಿನ ವಕ್ಷಸ್ತ್ರ ವಟಖಡ್ಗ ಮಂಡಲೋತ್ಪಲ ವಿಭ್ರಮ ಭ್ರಮರಿಯಪ್ಪ ಮನೋಹರಿ ರಾಜ್ಯ ಲಕ್ಷ್ಮಿ ಇದೇ ಉದಣ್ಣ ನೀನು ದರೆಗಂ ಪೆಂಡಂ ನಾನು ಆಟಿಸೊಡೆ ನಗಳತೆ ಮಾಸದಿ. The warrior and the winner and the warrior merge into one in this passage, just as the lady love and the lady land are collapsed together. The domains of love and war, Aham and Puram, become objects of Bahubali's sacrifice, which is also a conquest of war and women. But isn't this the meaning of the word Jina? Jina means conqueror. In this man-dominated landscape, the land as mother and the object of patriotism has not yet appeared. She is much younger than the land as lady love. In Jainism and Buddhism, both shamanic religions, Buddha and Mahavira, are therefore called Arhantas, meaning slayers of the foe, extending the military metaphor. Next, the transformation of the man hero into slave hero. Sang the Tamil Shaivite Bhakti poet Sundara. பித்தா பிறை சூடி பெருமானி அருளாரா எத்தாலும் மறவாதி நிற்கின்றேன் மனத்துன்னை வைத்தாய் வெண்ணெய் தென்பால் வெண்ணெய் நல்லூர் அரித்துறையுள் அத்தா உனக்கு ஆளா இனி இருப்பேன் எனலாலே. O mad one, O Lord with a crescent, O graceful one, I am thinking about you without forgetting. O God of Tiruvennai Nallur, on the southern bank of the river Pennai, how can I not say I am your slave? He poured out this song in a life-changing moment. When young and about to be married, a madman broke into the marriage hall and claimed that Sundarar was a slave, as per a legal document signed between him and Sundara's father. He produced a legally validated document to that effect, whereupon the madman took him to, according to the legend, to Vennayanallur Shiva temple and vanished into the Shivalingam. Sundara now knew that it was Lord Shiva himself who had come masking as a madman. He was filled with devotional love to Lord Shiva and spent the rest of his life singing and slaving for the Lord. During Bhakti period, Bhakta, also called Tondar, means servant, Adiyar, in fact the word Bhakti does not occur in early Shaivite or Vaishnavite texts. Adiyar, man of the feet, among Shaivas, and Alvas, that means drowned ones, that's why Ramanujan called his translation hymns for the drowning, among Vaishnavas, were all near synonyms of the slave, the conquered, and the antonym of Jina, the conqueror of the conquered. Later, Karnataka Shaiva Bhaktas become Sharanas, that is refugees against slaves, and Vaishnava Bhaktas are called Dasas, slaves again. Interesting question here. What happened to the love and valor of the ancient hero of the earlier period? Both these admirable attributes were now transferred to the Ishta Devata, the beloved deity, Vishnu or Shiva. Said Purandaradasa Vishnu, Lavanyadali node lokamohana nava yavadhaidiri node asurantaka. Look at his beauty, he enthralls the whole world. Look at his valor, he slew all asuras. In this new paradigm of the man hero, the bhakta ultimately becomes both the slaves and the beloved and the Lord, both man, lover, and man king. Thus the bhakta subjugates all human kings to the divine king. In bhakti, devotion to the Lord and devotion to the king are irreconcilable. This we should remember in the days of Desh Bhakti. Basavanna reduces the king hero to complete worthlessness. He says, when the hunter kills a rabbit, people buy it with a small currency. If it's the dead body of the ruler of the earth, they will not buy it in exchange even for a betel nut. I emphasize this point to remind myself that the latest hyped version of Bhakti, Desha Bhakti, is the antonym of the Bhakti of Bhaktas. This presentation is a humble attempt to trace how the hero myth changed as context changed. The paradigm remained with drastic shifts of meanings and associations. I would like to complete with another least discussed transformation of the god hero from king into the artisan in Lingayat Bhakti poetry of Kannada. Says a weaver poet, Dasimaya the weaver, after tightening the warp, after arranging the golden border, after pushing the pedal down with feet so that the frame moves up and down, the shuttle's point eats up the skein, who weaves the sari, you or me, O Ramanatha. So God from king to an artisan, and in some versions of Bhakti poetry also becomes the slave of the Bhakta. I am here tracing only the myth of man hero, and I also wanted to trace the history of the myth of woman hero from Silapadigaram into Bhakti period, but I defer it to another occasion.
Those who are sitting at the back, I request them to come forward because it's a live telecasting. It looks bad with the empty seats.
I think this is a very serious announcement because how we look is more important than how we are. I am very grateful for this, for the disquisition on myth in Karnataka and how the concepts of hero and heroine in the myth develop. I now request Professor Shirin Musvi to speak on myth and history in medieval times.
Mr. Chairman, the two other speakers, and fellow delegates. I consider it a privilege to be invited to speak in this symposium of the Indian History Congress. Myth, by its very definition, means a belief or a statement that is devoid of fact, being therefore often equated in dictionaries with the word fictitious. In relation to history, myth often arises out of sentiments about what should have happened as against what really have happened. Myth has therefore one reality behind it, a particular psyche in human beings promoting make-believe. In other words, a myth, once one identifies it, is less relevant to the time to which it relates than to the time when it is created or evolved. A historian's task is thus not limited to establishing what narrative belongs to the sphere of a myth, but also how and why it got created, elaborated, and embraced. Let me thus begin with myths, some myths from the medieval period, and I'll first take a myth which was perhaps created back in the 14th century. It was about the great services to Islam by Mahmud of Ghazni, who was proclaimed the sword of Islam. Isami, writing in the middle of the 14th century, not only showers in his Futuh Salatin praises on him for enslaving the women and children of Hindus, but reaches the heights of fantasy and perhaps recklessness by attributing a dream to Mahmud in which the Prophet of Islam himself appeared and said to him, "You deserve paradise as well as kingdom at one and same time. You have such a support to my Shariat that you have earned yourself both the words. Hence have no apprehensions. Henceforth, God is your helper. Destiny and faith are support of your cause." That rather speaks very poorly of Isami's own exaggeration, while he is perhaps bringing a bad name to the religion to which he belonged or in which he believed, and even talking on behalf of the Almighty God, in whom at least he believed, unlike me. Ziabarni, his contemporary, is not going to that extent, but in his Fatawa-e-Jahandari, he proclaims Mahmud to be the main exponent of suppression of Hindus and also rationalist and heretics against whom he was perhaps more than he was against the Kafirs. The way he depicts Mahmud might be consonant with his contemporary Isami, but to Professor Muhammad Habib, his ignorance of real Mahmud was appalling. However, a contemporary, Al-Biruni has a different attitude or view of Mahmud. According to him, Mahmud has utterly ruined the prosperity of the country of India and performed those wonderful exploits by which the Hindus became like atoms of dust scattered in all directions. Their scattered remains cherish, of course, the most inveterate aversion towards all Muslims. This is the reason to why Hindu sciences have retired far away from those parts of the country conquered by us and to Kashmir, Benares, and other places. And there, the antagonism between them and all foreigners receives more and more nourishment, both from political and religious reasons. That is what Al-Biruni's views are. But while he comes to describe his own attempts to get the Sanskrit works on different sciences and different scholarship, as well as to get Brahmins to explain those to him, to help him understand those, the entire narration, while he was still in Lahore, shows something totally different. He himself says that he was able to collect all the Brahmanic Sanskrit works with some efforts, but people were ready to provide them. He got the best Sanskrit scholars, the Brahmani scholars, to explain and teach him all those works. And when he started discussing some Greek sciences with them in his own words, people flocked together around me from all parts, wondering and most eager to learn from me. So, whatever was his assessment that what should have happened after the plunder by Mahmud of Ghazni, it appears that the situation was different. He himself was so moved by that, and the learnings he received from Brahmins and from Sanskrit work was that he writes, what scholar, however, has the same favorable opportunities to studying this subject as I have, that would be only the case with whom the grace of God accord. So learning Sanskrit and Hindu sciences to him was a work of grace of God. If we come one further thing which I would like to say here is that one very interesting point is that while Isami and Biruni are praising Mahmud like anything, and are showering all encomiums, one adjective which they should have added, that is Ghazi, the one who spreads religion and forces others to accept it, they never use. I tried my level best to go into the original sources. He is only called either Amir, not even Amirul Mominin, only Amir or Sultan. So that we have to keep in mind while I'll be trying to explain something further. A near contemporary or a person afterward, Kalhan, while he is narrating about the intrusion of Mahmud in Kashmir and the defeat of Tirlochan Pala on his hand, is simply placid. He attributes it to the follies of Tunga, the commander, who didn't pay heed to the caution given by Tirlochan Pala to him that he is not fully prepared and he should not try to make the first move. And only blames him, hardly says anything about Kashmir. Of course, he has decided that his it's a poetic work, is neutral, so he is not going neither to praise anyone not to criticize anyone. Now, if we come over to some of the realities of the work, one finds that in the 14th century, the famous Persian poet Shahzadi, in his Gulistan, writes something in a different vein about Mahmud. Like Isami, he is also attributing a dream or describing a dream, but not to any pious person like the Prophet himself. He says, a king of Khurasan saw Sultan Mahmud in his dream. His entire body frame had dissolved into the dust, except for his eyes, which were rotating, rather spinning in the sockets, as if he was looking around for something. Many of the scholars were invited, but they couldn't offer any interpretation of this phenomena or this dream. Finally, a dervish came and said, Mahmud is still watching that his possessions and dominions are in the hands of others. So you can very well understand the opinion. Of course, if you go over to history, the actual history, one knows that how Mahmud destroyed or plundered Khurasan and conquered it. And so much so that in 15th century, Mir Khund was the first who said that he can never use the word or the epithet of Ghazi as a suffix or prefix to Mahmud. One now comes to history and finds that Mahmud was always maintaining a large number of Hindu troops. One of his favorite commander was Tilak, a tantric from Kashmir, whom he gave much higher position. And even before Tilak joined him, after a much attempt to woo him, the fight between the Qazi and the Khaja and all that happened. It was that he was maintaining elephants and the Hindu forces, as the historians write, always balancing the Turks with the Hindus, equal in number. 4,000 slave soldiers from both the community. And once, while his Hindu soldiers were, there was a revolt and were killed, he then attacked the Muslims in the Jama Masjid on a Friday and the Christians in a church to take the revenge for the killing of his Hindu soldiers, and not even stopped on that, but also sacked the city. So for both, one can see that how much of a myth was there. I would only sum it up in the words of Professor, or by repeating the words of Professor Muhammad Habib, who writes, to later generations, Mahmud became arch fanatic he never was. And in that incarnation, he is still worshipped by such Musalmans as have cast off the teachings of Lord Krishna in their devotion to minor gods. I think that sums up the myth and its entire relevance. I'll come now to a less, or rather a other myth which is still by the medium of movies and other things going on, and that is of the Padmavati or Padmani, about whom we were hearing a few months before, or about a year. The story begins, as K. S. Lal explains, only with the Malik Muhammad Jaisi's one composition. He was a poet during the time of Alauddin Khalji. And he wrote this poem, Padmavat. in which he proclaimed that she was a princess of Ceylon and she was very beautiful. Rana Ratan Singh learned about her beauty from a parrot and went to Ceylon, spent 12 years trying to woo her, and at last brought her to Chittor. And here enters another mendicant. While she was trying to give alms to him, he saw her and immediately rushed to Sultan Alauddin Khalji to explain how beautiful she is, who then who then wrote to Ratan Singh that asking that he should send her to him. And while Ratan Singh, the Rana of Chittor, refused, he laid a siege and fought for full 8 years. Alauddin Khalji remained away from Delhi for full 8 years, and Rana Ratan Singh kept on fighting. About 12 years he has already spent in wooing her, 8 years now in protecting her. Finally, there, of course, in the 8 years' time, a friendship must have developed, and therefore Alauddin Khalji told him that, all right, I am ready to leave if you let me have a look of her. While he still resisted that, then Alauddin Khalji further came down and said, all right, let me have a look of her in a mirror image of her, for which the Rana agreed. Sultan went to the fort, and then while they were, after having a look at her mirror image, while he was coming out, Rana was talking to him, of course, as friendly gesture, and escorting him out. Then Alauddin Khalji, with a treachery, got this Ratan Singh arrested and took him to Delhi, where he was kept for quite some time. And finally, Padmini decided that she would go and submit herself to the Sultan so that Ratan Singh should be freed. But Ratan Singh's daughter simply didn't hear of it, and she said that it should not be done. And she said that it should be in another way. And 1600 litters with soldiers, the Rajput soldiers, should be sent, saying that they are Padmini is coming to surrender, while Padmini should not go. And they went over there, and by that mechanism, she was able to get Ratan Singh released, while Padmini stayed back at Chittor. On that, the Alauddin Khalji became very furious, and he attacked the Chittor fort and destroyed it, captured it. No more a mention of Padmini, what happened to her. This story then went to Farishta, and he made further twists. The final version you will be finding is in Veer Vinod of Shyamal Das, the official historian of the Rajput court. He tried to make it as much acceptable or reliable as could be possible. For him, it was not Ratan Singh going and spending 12 years there. It was not Alauddin Khalji spending 8 years. He has such as making it a little more, digestible, and saying that he came to attack, but then and he decided that there should be a compromise, and Rana was coming out, so he took him to where his main guards were. Rather, Alauddin Khalji said that, let me sit in your fort and discuss this thing. While he came, he by treachery got hold of Rana and took him out, and then imprisoned him. But then this daughter, both the forces were close by in Rajasthan, in Chittor, got him out of the problem, and Alauddin Khalji went back to Delhi. Now, an interesting story, all imagination one would, but now the situation has such arise that while a film is being made about it, there's so much hue and cry, as if it is a real something, the honor of the Rajputs is at stake and all those things. So, of course, one can very well understand that what really the intentions could have been, and how it is not something which relates to the medieval India, it is something which relates to our present times. When we are becoming more superstitious, I will say, because to say logical is not sufficient, and we would like to look for these sort of things to bring some further discord among people of this country. So, there are many others which I will be not going to. There is a myth about Akbar inventing a new religion, and that too I will skip because I don't think I have much time left with me. I would only come over to another type of myth building. Certain myths, of course, Jayassi didn't build a myth. He was simply writing a imaginary version, a story. He perhaps never would have thought that this will become a reason for a discord or something in the future. The future generations would have been imagined to be better intelligent. But there is another type of myth building which is in a, what I will say, for a good cause. Though myth building is for whatever cause is not to be accepted, at least by the historian. Nowadays, Audrey Truschke is trying to whitewash Aurangzeb. And therefore, she is trying to make us believe that Abul Fazl has never destroyed any temple, and whatever is written is wrong about him, and it is rather that is the, there was earlier, say, attempts as well, or other serious historical works, where Aurangzeb was, there was an attempt not to let him be made a demon, but a king who is fanatic or too religious or intolerant, whatever one may say. Even to say intolerant for Aurangzeb is a bit difficult, because anyone who has read his period knows who his main advisors and the closest nobles were. Everyone has heard of Jaswant Singh and Jai Singh. Any school textbook says he didn't impose any jizya as long as Jaswant Singh and Jai Singh were around, because that would have hurt them. They wouldn't have stood for it. And he cared for them. Professor Athar Ali already has showed us that in his nobility, the component of the non-Muslims were higher than the component of non-Muslims in Akbar's nobility. So, it is just like what one may say about Mahmud of Ghazni. You are a king, you want and you maybe have some fanaticism, but while it comes to the worldly matter, you are not going to bother with the religion. You may use it or misuse it, but not beyond that. And perhaps Aurangzeb's ideas were also like this. He destroyed, to say that Keshav temple was not destroyed is really a calumny, which is a fact. This temple was built by Bir Singh Bundela, the ruler of Orcha, Jahangir's most trusted noble, who at his instance murdered Abul Fazl. So you can see how close he was. And therefore the Bundela family, as well as the temple, remained protected. And of course, no temples were destroyed before Aurangzeb by any more ruler. Everybody knows how Akbar gave land grants to the temples, particularly the Vrindavan temples in Mathura. So, but everyone also knows that Aurangzeb first destroyed the boundary wall of that temple. And what did he do? It was after he has already imposed jizya, against which his elder sister Jahanara not only protested, but submitted a petition to him not to do it, signed by nearly all the nobles. He not only destroyed that, but took the entire thing from there and got it spread in a mosque built by, in the lawn of the mosque, built by Jahanara. So you can see what type of a man he is. Simply to hurt Jahanara, he can go to that extent why she was stopping him. So the attempt to keep on, and then finally in 1672, he raised it to ground. This is a correct statement that he didn't touch the Vrindavan temple at all. In fact, as Professor Irfan Habib and Tarapad Mukherjee's researches has showed us, there was no grants were stopped, new grants were not given, but the older continued. So you have to have a balanced view, and the whitewashing by saying that things which have happened, or to say that since Shivaji has taken the route of Mathura and Banaras, so Vishwanath and Keshavaraya temples were destroyed, is of course a childish thing. Shivaji couldn't have gone to that way and this way both, and the temples were not there to, the temples couldn't, but they were not living beings to give him shelter to be destroyed. So I would like to conclude with this, that it is the job of the historians to not only to see that how far the myths, or to see the facts of, or the reality of the myth, but also it is rather an unpleasant or disconcerting thing for a historian now to discuss only, or to go to research only about the myths, while there are many prejudices and other things, while there are so many real issues of history which concerns the normal human beings, the poor, the laborers, the peasants, and the workers and others, are still requiring their attention. So, but it is still the situation prevailing in our blessed country that myth still can grip people, and it becomes the job of the historian or duty of the historian to try to waste time on them. Thank you very much.
Well, we have had Professor Shireen Musvi's description of myths relating to medieval India. Myths both to denounce medieval rulers, and myths, as he has said, with good intentions of whitewashing certain deeds in medieval India. Both kinds of myths exist, and it is the task of the historian to distinguish between the two and to establish facts without fully impartially, and also to look at other important aspects of history in which facts have to be established, for which there is enormous material. So medieval Indian historiography has to develop if one enlarges one's horizons and doesn't act like a lawyer. I now request Professor Surjita Mahajan to speak on myths in the modern period.
Thank you, Professor Habib. I'm grateful to the organizers of the Indian History Congress, particularly to Professor Irfan Habib, Shireen Musfi, K.M. Shrimali, and R. Mahalakshmi for inviting me to be a part of this prestigious annual symposium. This year, as you know, it's a very, very interesting subject of myth and history. I'm going to talk about, as you might guess, those of you know a little about me, on myth-making in communal discourse. I begin with a little sentence from Eric Hobsbawm, but before that, I have to thank two of my students in particular, Shashi Bhushan, who I can see here in the audience, and Saib Bilawal, who's not here, but who have been absolutely, they have played a sort of totally stellar role in the last month or so, helping me in putting this paper together and drawing on their research on communalism. These are two of my research scholars. Thank you very much. I begin with a sentence from Eric Hobsbawm. Eric Hobsbawm says in his inimitable style, the whole function of history is to be a pain in the ass for national myths. There's another sentence I have from Romila Thapar in a very different vein, where she writes, she says, religious nationalism invents its own history. Myths seem to be swirling around us today. Myths of celibate peacocks, national birds procreating by dropping tears, myths of sage Kanad conducting nuclear tests lakhs of years ago, myths of Karna being born through genetic engineering, myths of Ganesha acquiring his form through plastic surgery. These are not advanced by maverick preachers or what we might call the lunatic fringe. What for me is important is that they are being advanced by very responsible members of society, indeed by the political class, by lawmakers, judges, chief ministers, nay, even prime ministers. These statements are made, they begin in the Lok Sabha, at the inauguration of a hospital by the prime minister in one case, and in the case of the national bird, while delivering judgments in no less than a high court. And what is interesting about these statements and how they become myths, which is what I want to discuss today, is how they resonate with something in the popular psyche and then become a part of public discourse. Coming to myth, the dictionary definition of myth would run thus: a fictitious tale, usually involving supernatural persons, some popular idea or historical phenomena. Myth and history, the two appear to evoke different worlds. Those who study myth believe it to be a better key to understanding phenomena. Those who study history, people like us, believe they owe it to their profession, as Shireen Musfi just put it, to pull out myth by its very roots, condemning it as a set of assumptions or beliefs that were evidently baseless. There is an implicit ranking evident in this, where history is clearly placed higher than myth as it is seen, more in line with what we might call objective reality, that reality being based as it is, we believe, on verifiable facts, and those facts, we believe, have been discerned from sites with official sanction, be it monuments or official repositories. On the other hand, myth gets equated with falsehood. This is in line with the distinction drawn from the ancient Greeks between what they called logos and mythos, the latter seen in the sense of fable, storytelling, or fiction. In fact, this continues to be, so many hundred years later, the common sense usage of the terms. That is, myth continues to be linked with the supernatural, the fictional, with fantasy, with tradition, and history, to quote Leopold Ranke, with the story as it really happened. Let me turn to Roland Barthes' in mythologies, I have a long quote, I'm just taking one sentence from that. Roland Barthes in Mythologies writes, myth is an inflection. Myth is the most appropriate instrument for the ideological inversion which defines this society, unquote. So then, as you might note, we have already moved in the course of this talk from a reading of myths as pre-existing or as ancient mythology to a concept of myths as tales which are constructed in order to convey a message. In the case that I will be taking up today, a political message. This is very similar to, you will recognize, Hobsbawm's concept of invention of tradition, a concept which demonstrates that what appear to be hoary traditions could well be of very modern provenance. That is, traditions get invented when society or a group feels the need to root present practices in the distant past, perhaps to give coherence to a present which is increasingly puzzling. So rather than talk of myths in the sense of ancient myths, as Professor Shiv Prakash spoke before me, myths which have been out there for long, I'm going to talk about myth-making as an act, a process. Thus, what I'm doing is, in a way, trying to blur the binary that there is between myth and history. In fact, this binary is not so sharp today, I would contend, than it was, say, a century ago. History as we know it today, post E.H. Carr and others, is not only or primarily about facts. In fact, as we know, perspective is embedded in facts. This begs the question, which is something which I am more interested in, which is, why do myths have the power that they have? To put it more simply, why are myths believed in? To me, the myth itself, or even the identity of the myth maker, is sometimes far less interesting than the process by which myths become myths. What does this tell us about society? What is the insight that this gives us into popular psyche? That is, the power of myths and their resonance, how this gets linked to what people are willing to believe. Some of the issues which come up in the making and reception, or what I might call the consumption of myths, can be illumined by a recent discussion that somebody drew my attention to on fake news. The question raised was, why are people willing to believe stories which evidently defy belief? A possible answer could be that people believe fake news, or myths in this case, because they come from a person with whom they share a worldview. When myths get spread through social media, through sharing, then sharing itself becomes a kind of testimony. That is, it's emanating from a known source. So it matters little in the spread of myth that it may only be sharing without specific endorsement. You well understand how stuff goes viral without even sometimes knowing where it emanates from. The power of popular mass media, especially of television, has been huge, and it has been used and misused, as the case may be. In our case, we are more interested in the misuse. This is the age of web pages, blogs, anonymous, I might even add morphed videos, where people have the liberty to write and reach a maximum audience without the compulsion which the professional historian, you and me, have of providing authentic sources or historical data. Looked at in this way, then, myth-making is not the prerogative of any social group or political formation. Any group looking for legitimacy for their present position or for their politics could turn to the past to establish a continuity, however nebulous that might be. One can distinguish between what one might call ordinary myths and political myths. Ordinary myths tend to originate locally and they spread socially in an organic manner. Political myths tend to have institutional support, and there's very often a design behind their spread. In India, as we know, myths about the Golden Age and many hundred years of slavery, which vary from 200 or 1,000 depending on your political predilection, and myths about the anti-colonial movement and liberation from colonial rule prevail. Myths around these tropes tend to resonate widely. Of course, the left, the center, and the right are equally adept at myth-making when needed. Why then do we discern that there is more myth-making on the right? I quote Roland Barthes again, just one quick sentence. He says, statistically, myth is on the right. There it is, essential, well-fed, sleek, expansive, garrulous. It invents itself ceaselessly. Many of the projects, unquote, many of the projects of the right wing involve revivalism, as we know, be it the imagining of the Kultur nation or empire building. It did strike me that Pax Britannica, for example, which was a key constituent of the ideology of the state in colonial India, directly invoked Pax Romana, the peace which was said to prevail in the Roman Imperium. I move on now to talk about myth-making in two senses. In the first part, I talk about myths on the making of the nation, and in the second part, I talk about myths in the communal discourse. I begin the first part with a sentence from Massimo d'Azeglio, a very well-known sentence, which you all know. He wrote, "We have made Italy, now we make Italians." This is in the context of the Italian unification. So this part I've called a tale of two Sindhus. Now, the necessity to impart legitimacy to the somewhat fragile nationhood of Pakistan, particularly after the body blow of 1971, spawned writing which sought to lay an ideological foundation for the nation. This was a particularly difficult endeavor, as regional identities were then on the rise in Sindh and the frontier province, leaving only Pakistan as the rump of Pakistan, leaving only the Punjab as the rump of Pakistan. The text I take up for discussion here is a work by Etzaz Ehsan, a senator of the Pakistan People's Party, leader of the opposition, activist of the human rights movement, and a leading lawyer of Pakistan who was Benazir Bhutto's right-hand man. The book he wrote, called The Indus Saga, interestingly was published under two titles, in Pakistan with the subtitle The Making of Pakistan, and in India by Roli Books in 2005 under the subtitle From Patliputra to Pakistan. Now, what is interesting about Ehsan's The Indus Saga is it's a very self-consciously modeled on Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery of India. It is inspired by the need to unravel the roots of the Pakistani nation, that is, create, as it were, a foundational myth for the Pakistani nation, but very interestingly, many years after the event. Etzaz Ehsan wrote this book during his spell in prison. Much as Discovery of India was written by Nehru during the long years he was detained in the Ahmednagar fort during the Second World War, the parallel, of course, ends here. Nehru's work was inclusive in its approach. His search for an emblematic historical figure for the newly emerging Indian nation ended in Ashoka, significantly neither Hindu nor Muslim. For Ehsan, the Indus person was distinct from the Indian. So what Ehsan does is he goes on to locate the roots of Pakistan in the Indus culture. And the important point that he's making here is that this Indus culture is a counterpoint to the Indo-Gangetic civilization, which we commonly believe to be the common heritage of the Indian subcontinent, even for the parts which have ceded from India or have got separated in 1947. I quote a line from the book, As I journeyed into the distant past, he wrote, it dawned upon me that the almost 5.5 of the last 6,000 years that Pakistan has existed. Let me repeat that again. 5.5 of the last 6,000 years that Pakistan has existed, Indus has seldom been a part of India. Questioning the tropes of intrigue and betrayal that enveloped the writing of the history of the Muslims, he put forward a picture of the Muslim as a fighter. The Indus person, he wrote, was tough and indefatigable. He was a survivor. Sitting in his prison cell, Ehsan said he heard the hooves of the horses of the warriors. He was full of pride at the valor of the heroes of the peasant clans and the heroism of revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh. Ehsan is at pains to demonstrate that this is the land of the poetry of Khusro, Hussain, Bahu, Bulla, Waris, and Latif, that Khusro came from Patiali village in Eta district in UP, and that the Punjabi Sufis too belong to the larger area of Punjab, including the eastern parts, which are no longer in Pakistan, is an obvious case of inconsistency, but I think we'll let it go. It is in the context of what he sees as the misappropriation of Jinnah and Muslim League by the fundamentalist elements in Pakistan, which he is very unhappy that they have become the custodians of the ideology of Pakistan. So he says that what he's writing, his effort to discover what he calls the real history of the origins of Pakistan, he says, to trace our own steps, in his words, from prehistory to partition. He goes on to say, Indus has been Pakistan. 1947 was only a reassertion of that reality. Now, while the nationalist imperative behind the argument of Pakistan having its own separate civilizational trajectory and basis from India is something that one can appreciate, and while the Indus idea is apparently secular at first sight, but Ehsan's categories remain Muslim and Hindu. His central argument when he comes to the more modern period is about the divide between the Hindus and the Muslims, and the rest of the book becomes a very poor restatement of the kind of position that Ayesha Jalal and others have taken on the formation of Pakistan. So we'll let it rest there. What I found very interesting was that there is a Hindu communal viewpoint, interestingly advanced by Godse, which also takes up the Sindh as the defining identity of India. That is, Akhand Bharat or United India, Godse believed, was mortally wounded by the severing of its limbs, that is, the eastern and western halves of Pakistan. Godse wrote, and he said in his speech at the trial, that the Gandhi murder case, he said, these wounds can be healed only by reuniting the two countries. In fact, at a meeting in Bombay in 1993, his brother Gopal Godse, who was alive then, asked the audience then to donate liberally for the task of what he called liberating the Sindhu River by bringing Pakistan under Hindu Rashtra. Gopal Godse went on to say, he said, the Sindhu River is sacred to the Hindus because the Vedas and the holy books were composed on its banks. Nathuram Godse told his brother Gopal in jail, this is according to Gopal Godse, in an interview that he gave to Frontline many years later, he said his ashes, that is, Nathuram Godse had made it very clear that he wanted his ashes to be kept till India was Akhand again. And then they would be immersed in the Sindhu or the Indus River. What was the reason behind this? Not just Akhand Bharat. Godse said, I do not want my ashes to be immersed in any other river in India, as all these rivers were polluted by Gandhiji's ashes. myth-making in the communal discourse. By looking at Ehsan and Godse on the Sindhu, defining the Hindu nation in two very different kinds of ways, we have now moved from beyond the foundational myths of the nation to myths which are created to legitimize the communal point of view. Indeed, it could be said that myth-making is central to communal discourse. The method followed is, as we all know, to repeat and reiterate assumptions which emanate from or are in sync with popular perceptions and existing biases. The hope is that the very act of repetition of even a baseless assumption will eventually lead to belief. It's worth noting that many of the myths propagated today by opinion makers associated with the present regime go back in time. That is, they were prevalent during the rule of the earlier NDA government, and more importantly, many of these biases and perceptions, they may take a different form today. They go back, particularly the prejudices about Muslims, the Muslim community, go back to the time around the independence and partition of India, as we will see very quickly. Now, there is a section I have here on the professional historian and the attacks on academic history, which I'm going to just leave out and move on. What is interesting about what I'm calling the communal distortion of nationalism or of the national movement, I've called this section of appeasers, betrayers, and unifiers, nationalist leaders in the communal discourse. Now, before selective appropriation began of nationalist icons, which is very widespread today, many of you have been talking about this in different panels today, it's important to note this was not the first reaction. Golwalkar, in a bunch of thoughts, in fact had dismissed anti-British nationalism as reactionary. And he had said that anti-British nationalism has had disastrous effects upon the freedom movement, its leaders, and the common people. But after independence, and particularly after there was a societal consensus on the significance of the freedom struggle and on nation building, there is today a tendency, as we know, to appropriate nationalist leaders, nationalist icons. This possibly emerges from the need on the part of the Hindu communal formation to gloss over a past which is not exactly covered in glory, to put it mildly. In fact, these groups did not have a role in the freedom struggle, as we know. The irony is that they are invoking the nation today, but they have had no role in the making of this nation. They assert their claim to be the preeminent nationalist party, both by highlighting and exaggerating the role of their own leaders. It could be Savarkar, it could be Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. On the other hand, they claim the leaders of the freedom struggle as one of their own. I'll just take up one example here. Perhaps the most blatantly incredulous myth-making pertains to Gandhiji. Now, we might say that this is a total travesty, given the fact that they were not just not part of the movement, but as we know, that it was members of the Hindu communal groups who were behind the assassination of Gandhi. There are countless examples of where RSS-minded groups, be it the Pragnya Prabha or others, how they hold meetings at Rajghat, pay lip service to Gandhi, etc. Now, the vilification of Gandhi, which is a kind of parallel discourse, as it were, along with the appropriation, this is something which has been going on for a very long time. 70 years ago, looking at in the RSS lexicon, Gandhiji was called the Dushtatma. Then, as we know, Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte, Professor Irfan Habib spoke about Godse and Gandhi today in the Gandhi panel today in a very moving lecture. The burden of the charge that was being made at this time was do not appease Muslims with Hindu sacrifices. This was the tenor of what Godse said, and this was increasingly getting resonance from inner society which had been torn asunder by the communal conflict which followed and was attended upon the partition. We must remember, as was pointed out today morning again, that this was not Godse's action, was not the action of some lunatic or some person who was some misguided youth. No. The Hindu Mahasabha was clearly involved in his assassination. In fact, one could say that along with denigrating Gandhi, there is a parallel discourse of exaggerating the role of Savarkar as a nationalist hero, where his role in the conspiracy to assassinate Gandhiji is conveniently glossed over, and we are asked to remember only that Savarkar who is the Krantivir Savarkar. But of course we know better. We know that Savarkar, though he was not convicted in 1949, but later on, before the Kapoor Commission, it became amply clear his accomplices went on to testify to his role, and these records are now available to everybody. This, in a way, this counterposing Savarkar to Gandhi, this reached a climax when Savarkar's portrait was unveiled in Parliament in 2003 during the time of the then NDA government, despite widespread protest at this insult to the memory of Gandhiji. And to add insult to injury, it was placed opposite Gandhiji's portrait in Parliament. So what do we have in this myth-making? In this myth-making, the national past gets reconstructed in keeping with communal ideology, indeed communal practice. Gandhi becomes the Deshdrohi, the traitor, Godse the national hero. Gandhiji's martyrdom, his shahadat, becomes Asurvad. This is again the words which are used in the Hindu communal discourse. They call it Asurvad, or the slaying of a demon, in the communal rewriting of our history. In fact, just a month ago, activists of the Hindu Mahasabha in Aligarh, a certain Pooja Shakun Pandey, who was described as the national secretary of the All India Hindu Mahasabha, fired the first bullet on what was an effigy of the Mahatma, an effigy which was filled with balloons filled with red-colored water to give the dramatic effect of blood. The media, when we looked into this incident, had been already alerted to the plan in advance, and as you all know, this video went totally viral on social media. Of course, there's a lot of doublespeak. Ram Madhav, the National General Secretary of the BJP, wrote on the very same day that this was happening in Aligarh, in the Indian Express on 30th January, he wrote an article called Betrayal of the Mahatma, where he condemned the murder as a heinous crime. But interestingly, he said this was because of the pent-up anger and frustration, again, a few misguided youths, over what they perceived as his policy of Muslim appeasement. There's no mention of the fact, of course, that these so-called misguided youths were schooled in the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha. They were its activists, and that Muslim appeasement was a charge which was repeatedly made by these organizations over the years. In fact, if we look at September and October 1947, these 2 months in Delhi, we find that a fear psychosis was created by the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha that neo-Muslims from Bharatpur and Alwar, and they were being backed by Muslims in Hyderabad and Kashmir. These rumors were spread that they were armed to the teeth, they were coming to Delhi, and that they were going to take over Delhi. In fact, what is the reality? Professor S. Gopal, in his book on Nehru, has shown us that there were 700 FIRs were filed against the RSS members in the first 2 months after August 1947, which listed attacks on villages and individuals and which cited collection of arms and incitement to violence. The organizer claimed that the Hindu Sahayata Samiti had collected over 1 lakh signatures. Again, this is a myth, of course. This figure appears to be very unlikely given that this was in curfew-ridden Delhi. In the last part, which I'll just summarize due to the lack of time, I've talked about the more current myths which are being propagated about the relationship between the principal leaders of the national movement. In this rendering, Gandhi, the Chatur Banya, has propped up his protege and favorite Nehru. He has ousted the deserving Patel, cheated him of his rightful claim to prime ministership. Even Subhash Bose is seen as a victim of Nehruvian machinations. Nehru bashing then becomes important in the concerted attempt to build up Patel's stature. I'm not going into the details, but we know that it was the Prime Minister himself who fired the first salvo, as it were, right? He was the one who first said, had Sardar Patel been India's first Prime Minister, a part of Kashmir would not have been under the control of Pakistan. We know very well that both Nehru and Patel were very much played very important roles in the accession of the states. This has been attested to by Rajmohan Gandhi in his book on Patel. This has been attested to by V. Shankar, who was Patel's political secretary, and this has been also attested to by V.P. Menon, a very senior civil servant who has written on the integration of states, where he was Patel's right-hand man, but he is very clear in his book, Story of the Integration of the States, that Nehru and Patel were all doing this together. So this image that is being propagated of Nehru as this ruthless, power-hungry man who would do anything to eliminate rivals, there's just one sentence that I must share with you because of how incredulous it is, where it was said that Nehru used Stalin to get rid of Bose, that Bose took shelter in the Soviet Union, and then Nehru prevailed upon Stalin to have him bumped off. So this is the kind of thing. Along with Gandhi, to whom lip service is being paid, and I'm just on the last paragraph, the Congress leader, Vallabhbhai Patel, I've just mentioned, he is glorified as the Iron Man. We know about the Statue of Unity, of course. Very interestingly, built from Chinese steel. I don't know how many of you remember that when it had been declared in 2014, when the Prime Minister announced the statue, he had said, drawing from an analogy with the Ram Mandir, he had said that every Indian must contribute steel, that's iron, to make this statue. This call had been given. Obviously, somewhere along the way, it was forgotten, and we had Chinese steel, which went into this. And what we found very interesting when we were looking at this event recently was that this Statue of Unity, not only is it being promoted by tourism departments, which of course you would all know, but it's already found its way to a popular TV show, Tarak Mehta Ka Ulta Chashma, in which the characters in that show, they visit the site of Statue of Unity, they go there as tourists, and then they are duly impressed, they are taken around, etc. So it's very worrying. It's almost as if there is a new category of historical sites which has been created, which are state-produced and state-authenticated historical sites. I end with a question. After the above countering of the myths with some of what one might call the reality about the movement, an uncomfortable question remains for the historian. Why does myth not dissolve, even when shown to be counter to historical facts? Is it the case that the success of a historical myth depends on its very unverifiability? Or is it that academic scholarship does not resonate as much as popular history? Whatever the answer, the questions need some pondering over by this august body of historians. Thank you.
Friends, I am very grateful to the three speakers, even when they exceeded the time. But we learned more and more because of that. I would like to argue that there are innocent myths also. All religion is myth, for example, and one can't obviously live without it. We are driving out the Urdu language, but the great Urdu poet Ghalib had said it, हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत लेकिन दिल को बहलाने को ये ख्याल अच्छा है. We know there is nothing like paradise, but still it keeps us happy. So innocent myths keep us alive, otherwise there will be no religion left, because all religion is myth. Of course, there is also a problem in historiography, because we now construct histories, and Professor Sucheta Mahajan raised it very well in connection with Pakistan, but it's also really true for India also. Because our boundaries, even the United India boundaries, were never there in history. All the time we deal with historical evidence within modern political boundaries, which make no sense when you are talking of Gupta period or Maurya period or the Indus civilization. And in this sense, I think that Pakistan has a point, and not all, and actually this was first suggested by Major Ishaq, one of the communist leaders in Pakistan, that it should be the Indus Basin-based country. And geographically and historically, that's a very sustainable idea. And I don't know what the historian whom Professor Mahajan mentioned is, but Naqvi, who was a fellow product of AMU, he went to Pakistan, was the chief engineer in Pakistan, has written a long book on Indus Basin, a history. And all the Indian historians are there, Rumila Thapar, Ram Sharan Babu, all the other Indian historians are there. And the national movement is there, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and so on, without any reference to communalism at all. So it's possible to write, and certainly if Pakistan is to be a country, they have to construct a secular history, and their geography now is consistent. The Indus Basin history, I mean, it doesn't matter whether Amritsar or on this side or that side, there is an Indus Basin which could have a history. So obviously, modern historiography, whether it is Hungary or Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, must proceed with political boundaries. And it is important to establish that within that boundary, there should not be any myth-making. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan will always be in national memory as a great freedom fighter, whatever be the character of Pakistan. So, historians, in whichever country they are, whether India or Pakistan or Hungary or Russia or China, they must get down to facts and certainly distinguish between history and non-facts. And the real problem is when myth-making begins deliberately, as in the case of the Hindu communal approach or as in the case of Muslim approach. I will end by quoting an article in the Dawn, which was published in Journal of Pakistan Historical Society, that Pakistan has a special problem. Every nation has its liberators. India has Gandhi and Nehru and, other countries. The trouble with Pakistan is that Pakistan builders never fought for its freedom. Others did. And that that problem has to be solved. We have now the same problem that our great nationalists, their predecessors never fought for freedom. They denounced the national movement, and now they are, of course, posing as the great nationalists. So both sister countries have similar problems of psyche, myth and fact, and let us historians in both countries, let us rise and resist the myth and create proper history. Well, thank you very much, friends.
There's an announcement to be made. The Executive Committee of the Indian History Congress will meet at 9 o'clock today, so members are requested to be present for this. I'm sorry about the late announcement for this. We didn't have an opportunity to do so further. If there are any Executive Committee members here, please inform others who are not here. We'll try and get in touch with them individually also. But please note that it will be held at 9 p.m. today. Thank you.